Jūs jau saprotat, kamēr visi nebūs nobalsojuši, pusdienpauzes nebūs.
Yeah, no worries.
Okay, Søren, we are ready for your explanation of how it works, how good it works, and is it normal that in some countries we just start to apply it, and in some countries we will be, at the end of this day, the best possible appliance of this system?
Well, thank you very much, and good morning to everybody. I'm very pleased and honored to be here in Riga to give this presentation for you. And let me just start off by a brief introduction of myself. My name is Søren Kristensen, and I come from Denmark. My nationality is Danish. When I stand here in front of you, I actually have three different identities. One, and that's the formal reason why I'm here, is that I am one of the experts attached to the European ECVET Secretariat. And I'll come back later to what the ECVET Secretariat is and what it does. Which means that I fairly regularly go around in Europe to events like this to give sort of a European perspective on ECVET and explain how it's implemented. Secondly, I'm also a member of the Danish national team of ECVET experts. Each member state has appointed a set of of national experts. I believe you have four in Latvia. In Denmark we have 8. But I'm one of these 8 national experts in Denmark who is responsible for helping practitioners implement ECVET in a national perspective. So that's my second identity. And then my third identity, or the third hat that I'm wearing, is that I am an independent researcher. I do research in education and training, and as such one of the things that I have dealt with very much in my research activity is transnational mobility. And this is sort of a bit outside of ECVET as such, but it deals with the same thematics. So I have these 3 hats that I'm wearing, and most of the time I'll be wearing the hat of the European ECVET Secretariat. Sometimes I will say something that relates to the Danish situation, and sometimes I'll step a bit outside and try and give it from sort of like, if you like, an overall perspective, from the perspective of educational research. So these are the 3 identities that I have, and I'll try to make visible every time what kind of hat I'm wearing when I give some statements. The headline of this seminar is ECVET Step by Step. And I would like to start off by a step by step, but not from a practical, but from a historical angle. Why is it that ECVET has been created and introduced? And I've just give you a very, very brief historical timeline. I'm not going to say a lot. The interesting thing here is that, that's from an educational perspective. Very often when you talk about geographical mobility in an educational context in Europe, you tend to assume, well, that was started off in higher education. But if you look at it from an EU perspective or an EEC perspective, it would be in this case, actually the very first exchange or mobility program in a European context was the so-called European Workers' Exchange Program that was started already in 1964. So that's way ahead of higher education. And that program existed until 1992, where it was superseded by the Petra II program. And what was significant about the Petra II program is that for the first time it was made possible to involve vet learners, vet students, apprentices in mobility, because that hadn't been a legal possibility until then. So it progressed. I would also call your attention to the Action Plan Mobility for 2000. That's the first time that we actually have in Europe a policy covering so-called learning mobility in all sort of spheres of the educational world. The Copenhagen process, I'll come a bit back to that because that somehow creates a foundation for ECVET. And I'd also, I'm sure you already know that, draw your attention to the so-called European Quality Charter for Mobility, which is an outcome of the Copenhagen process, as is ECVET. And then you have, of course, the Erasmus+. But you can see that it's quite substantial what has happened in the field of geographical mobility. And why is the EU, why is Europe so interested in promoting mobility? Well, it has a number of reasons, and I can just briefly mention 4 of them. One of them is that mobility in education and training will promote labor market mobility. So it will promote the free movement of person, which is one of the cornerstones on which the European Union is built. Secondly, if you send young people abroad, so it's a theory anyway, they will open their mind, they will acquire a European outlook as opposed to a strictly nationalist outlook. Thirdly, mobility is a way of sharing educational resources in Europe. We can send people to where a particular kind of learning is best given, and then we can exploit the resources of Europe much better than if we try to do everything just within our own narrow national context. And finally, there's a pedagogical perspective as well, and this is one where I've done a lot of research, that mobility is a pedagogical tool which you can use to impart certain knowledge, skills, and especially competences, responsibility, autonomy, that other tools may not do in the same way. So briefly, they are the reason why the European Union put so much effort into promoting mobility. And if you look at the situation as it is now in Europe, we are now in the first phase of the Erasmus, we're at the end of the first phase of the Erasmus Plus program, which started in 2014 and ends next year in 2020. Within that period, 650,000 vet learners and staff will have participated, will have benefited from mobility grants. 650,000 may not be a lot compared to the number of vet learners in Europe, the total number. 2 things that you should bear in mind. The first is that in the next phase of the Erasmus Plus program, budgets for mobility are likely to be tripled, which means that suddenly it will be a lot more participants. Secondly, Erasmus Plus is not the only mobility program or scheme that you find in Europe. You find many schemes also at national, binational, and international level that sort of complements what's happening in Erasmus Plus. I believe here in Latvia, you use also the Nord Plus program. You know that? I can see some people nodding. There are also people who use financing from the so-called structural funds, notably the European Social Fund and the Interreg funds, to promote mobility as part of activities. And in many other countries, you find programs that support mobility. We don't really know how big mobility is. We've several times tried to undertake research programs to map the mobility landscape, but we know that mobility in terms of quantity is a lot bigger than Erasmus+. So we are actually dealing with a substantial number of people here. There are 2 things that I would like to underline here when I'm trying to give a sort of a picture of the mobility landscape in Europe. The first of them is that about 3/4 of all mobility activities in vocational education and training are organized as placements in enterprises. Only about 1/4 go from school to school. I don't know exactly what the situation is like here in Latvia. In Denmark, in my own country, actually it's more likely 85 or 90% of all mobility activities that are undertaken as placements. And this in turn gives some specific challenges and also opportunities for mobility. But at European level, if we look at Erasmus Plus, for VET, 3/4 of all mobility activities are placements. The second issue that I'd like to highlight here is the fact that in the past years and in the years to come, we have seen an increased focus on long-term mobility. And when I talk about long-term mobility here, I talk about mobility that's more 12 weeks or more, 3 months or more. That's the official definition of long-term mobility. You've all heard about Erasmus Pro, I'm sure, which is a sort of a sub-strand of the Erasmus Plus program that finances stays abroad for VET students and apprentices of 3 months and more. This is going to be even more accentuated in the future. We would like to send in Europe more young people out for longer periods of time. And that, of course, also puts an added emphasis on recognition and on quality. Because if you send somebody out for 2 weeks, if they learn absolutely nothing, then at least you can say, well, it's only 2 weeks, we can catch up when they come back. If you send them out for 6 months, then you need to be 100% sure that they actually learn something that can be recognized as part of that qualification. Otherwise, they will not be able to get that qualification. So suddenly, recognition is becoming more and more of an emphasis. And these are if you like, the background for introducing ECVET. This need for recognition. We need to ensure that VET learners, when they go out, that this is actually recognized as part of their stay. If you say that you can go out for 3 months, but that means that we will lengthen your stay at the end. And this was the situation in many member states not too long ago. If you go for 3 months abroad, we'll lengthen your program. You will be a student for 3 months more. So therefore, recognition is something that we need to promote. Secondly, we also need to promote transparency. Our VET systems in Europe are very, very diverse. It's not like, in higher education, you do have some kind of harmonization. You do have a situation where practically all European countries, they operate with a 3+2+3 model. Bachelor, master, and PhD. That's the same all over. It's not the same with VET. You have very, very big differences in duration and in contents. And even though the headline is the same, bricklayer, a bricklayer is a bricklayer, not necessarily. There are very big differences between individual member states. And if you send somebody abroad as a bricklayer, you can't, without checking actually what's does it mean in that particular context, you can't be 100% sure of that they will learn the things that go into your qualification as, in this case, bricklayer. So transparency, how can we see actually through the system and to see precisely what do they contain and how does that correspond to what we're doing? Quality is another issue. I mentioned that 650,000 learners will have participated in the first period of the Erasmus Plus program. And in itself, this is meaningless. It doesn't really have a lot of importance that 650,000 people went abroad, taken in itself. What is important is what they learned. If they go out, and if they didn't learn anything, you might as well have kept them at home. It would have been better. So quality, how can we ensure that they actually come back with learning outcomes that are needed and that are required to be, so that it can be recognized as part of a qualification. This also requires, and this is a concept that you'll hear often in ECVET context, mutual trust. We can do so much in terms of transparency, but it's also necessary that we do have some kind of trust, that I know if I send my students, apprentices to you in another country, I can be sure that they will learn something that will make the experience worthwhile. And finally, which is also a sort of like a key term in ECVET, common language. We need to have a mutual language, some kind of VET Esperanto that ensures that we know what we're talking about, that we are not talking about, we think we are talking about one thing, but at the other end they experience that this is something else because that particular term has got another meaning in their language. So these needs are the background for ECVET. They're important to understand if you want to grasp ECVET as a system that it builds on, it addresses these particular needs. And ECVET itself, it was, as I said, it originated in the Copenhagen process, which is the resolution from 2002 about transparency, recognition, and quality in VET. It was an issue there that we need to promote these things in Europe. And how do we do it? Well, the European Quality Charter is one thing. ECVET is actually another thing that came out, that was born out of the Copenhagen process. And it's a recommendation that was passed in 2009. And it's actually very, very important that it is a recommendation, because recommendations are not obligatory for member states to implement in this, or they can choose to implement only parts of it. And that is very important when you deal with partners abroad, because in some countries ECVET is not applied all the way across the system. They have only chosen to apply it in specific contexts, like, and now I'm talking as a Danish national ECVET expert, in Denmark ECVET is only an issue with regard to mobility. It's not used in the system as such. It means that our qualifications are not subdivided into units of learning outcomes, for instance. So therefore you can't automatically assume that ECVET will be the same, the implementation of ECVET will be at the same level everywhere in Europe. I mentioned that it's an outcome of the Copenhagen process. I will also mention that, and that's fairly obvious, that it's called the credit transfer for VET, and it was inspired by what we have in higher education, the ECTS, which was part of the sort of what's called the Bologna process of higher education, where higher education, they decided on a common system for credit transfer. At least the original idea with ECVET was to do something similar for vocational education and training. And as I've already mentioned, the task is easier in higher education because there are common structures. This is not the case in VET. And the fourth thing about ECVET is that it has, in a sense, a dual purpose. Some of you who have attended the national ECVET forums that are held every year, or who have seen the webinar that has been produced about ECVET, called ECVET for Beginners, or Basic ECVET. I forget the exact title of it, but it was something that we made in the Secretariat just to give sort of a very, very basic introduction to ECVET. And there ECVET is symbolically depicted as a boat with two sails. And one of the sails has mobility on it, and the other sail has flexible pathways or lifelong learning. And one of them is only concerned with transnational relationships, that's the mobility. The other is national, has systemic implications. And as I said, in some member states, it's not only my member state, my country, Denmark, it's also in Germany, and funnily enough, it's also a place like the UK. There is a decision only to implement ECVET in relation to mobility. But it means that in terms of mobility, ECVET and mobility, we are very far advanced because the principles are generally accepted in a mobility context. We're not so far in the sort of, if you like, the systemic part of it. But the theme of today is geographical mobility, so I don't need to go into these differences or difficulties. But I will move on to the ECVET principles. What, if you read the recommendations, the text of the recommendations from 2009, what does it say? What is ECVET? What do you need to do in order to implement ECVET? First of all, it says that it needs to be that it is based on a learning outcomes-based approach, which means that you look at not how a person has achieved some learning, but you look at what they actually know, can do, and understand after a learning process. And that's a very important thing because that focuses the attention on the actual outcome and not on the process as such. As I mentioned before, it doesn't really matter if you send somebody out to another country for a period of time. That's not important in itself. What is important is what they learn and what they bring back with. That can be taken and assessed independently of each other and accumulated to a qualification. And they are associated with, as you know from the ECTS, with credit points to indicate the workload. And in ECVET context, 60 ECVET points is equal to 1 year's study workload, learning workload. So that's a way of explaining when you have a unit of learning, how much time or how much should that actually fill in terms of a full qualification. And in an ECVET context, systemic context, again, these can be accumulated so that you can gather, if you go to the extreme, you can gather units here, there, from, for instance, work-based learning, or you can go to evening school, or you can just study on your own, or whatever. But they can be assessed, and then you can combine them, accumulate them, and when you have amassed enough ECVET points, you can exchange them to a qualification. And that's one of the things that's difficult for some countries, because this leads to a so-called credit-based system. Credit-based system, if you know the education system or the vocational training system in the UK, they have a credit-based system. They have in principle a system where you can take units independently and then combine them to a qualification. In Denmark, the ministry, the social partners, the politician says, we are not interested in a credit-based system, so therefore, when we implement ECVET, we are not implementing credit points. And with regard to mobility, it's a decision of the individual project how these units, they are composed. So they are not given beforehand. What is also a key principle of ECVET is that it sets down some procedures called assessment, validation, and recognition. And there are 3 separate processes. I'll come back to them in a moment because I'll try and go through sort of an ECVET step by step, as I announced, on a practical level. But basically, ECVET is, how do you see that these learning outcomes that were planned, they are actually acquired? Validation is the process where you check whether they actually fit into the qualification for which they are intended. And recognition is the official stamp. This stay abroad is part of a qualification, an integral part of a qualification, which means that you don't need to do extra time afterwards because you have acquired this learning already. And then you also have the documentation tools, the memorandum of understanding, the learning agreement, and the transcript of records. They're all mentioned in the recommendation. We're going to talk about in one of the workshops about memorandum of understanding, a learning agreement, and also transcript of records. I will just indicate how they fit into an sort of like an ECVET activity, a mobility activity that's done in an ECVET perspective by looking at mobility in 3 different stages. So what we normally do, there is a understanding mobility is not just the period spent abroad, it's also what goes on before, and it's also what goes on afterwards. And before mobility, in an ECVET perspective, what is required if you want to implement ECVET? First of all, you have a partner abroad with whom you are going to undertake the mobility activity. And you have to sort of delineate the playing field. What is this actually about? How are we going to do it? And this is done in an so-called memorandum of understanding, where you set down the basic, if you like, foundation of the project. What's this about? How many people are participating? Who are the partners? Who is responsible for what? And how is especially assessment going to be could be done? Then you also need to agree on learning outcomes and units of learning outcomes. What is this precisely that we are trying to achieve this with this project? Why are we sending the participants abroad? What kind of learning is it that we want them to acquire? Then you also need to agree on ECVET points. If you use ECVET points, in many countries they don't use ECVET points. If you use ECVET points, it's important in your context. So agree on ECVET points. You need to make a so-called learning agreement which states precisely what kind of learning outcomes are to be acquired, and which is signed not just by the partners, and this is very important, but also by the learner, him or herself. I don't know whether you're actually allowed to say him or her, but the learner itself or whatever. So that means that it has to be, when they signed this, it means that it's very important that they have understood what it actually means. Because if a learner, for instance, has not understood what is actually the learning objectives of this stay, then there is a chance that they will pull in a different direction. If the partner has not understood why it is that we are sending students, apprentices abroad, what we want them to learn, then of course you can have a disaster if they come back and they've acquired something that's completely different. That's not part of the qualification that they are studying or that they're doing in their home country. So therefore, it's very important to find a way of expressing learning outcomes that's understandable to all those involved, including the learners. And I think there is a workshop also on that later on this afternoon. Finally, you need to agree, and that's actually what you should do in the memorandum of understanding, how are we going to assess, and especially who is going to assess whether the learning outcomes they have actually been fulfilled. And in most cases, in an ECVET context, it's done by the partner abroad. Sometimes it's also done afterwards by the home institution. But what we want to avoid is a situation where they are assessed both places. So you need to agree when is assessment going to take place. In most projects, it's done, and I'll come back to that. It's done during the stay because most of them, the mobility activities are placements, and assessment in placements are often done as a sort of so-called formative evaluation by the host, by the placement enterprise, where they sign afterwards a paper saying, yes, the participant has learned the thing. We have observed the learner, and we can see that they have acquired the learning outcomes that were the original reason why this project was undertaken. So it's, in this case, it's assessed by somebody in the enterprise, and then what they do is that they will issue a so-called transcript of learning, which is basically just a document, personal document therefore it's sometimes also called a personal transcript because it's one that belongs to the learner. The learner gets a document, says, you have been here with us in this enterprise or in this school, and you have learned these things, and there it's signed. And this is also something that we are going to look into in more details this afternoon. I mentioned the memorandum of understanding, and I mentioned the learning agreement. There we have developed within ECVET so-called templates, forms that can be used when you conclude a memorandum of understanding or a learning agreement. With transcript of learning, it's mentioned in the recommendation there should be one for ECVET, but when ECVET was being implemented, somebody raised the objection, well, we already do have a way of documenting learning outcomes because we have Europass mobility, and that's exactly the same thing. So therefore, what we use as transcript of learning is Europass. It's not under an ECVET heading, but it fulfills the role of the transcript of learning that's mentioned in the recommendation. So the transcript of learning is Europass mobility. Then, in an implementation phase of ECVET, what's going to happen after the participant has returned? Well, first of all, you need to check from the transcript of learning, did the learner actually learn the things that are relevant to this qualification? And that's called a validation. And that's usually the school, or it's in most cases the vet school that does this. Then it also needs to be formally recognized as part of the qualification, get a stamp. Yes, this is it's an integral part of the qualification. And that is often done by qualification authorities. But in some countries, and now I put on my cap as a Danish national expert, in Denmark, for instance, the qualification authorities have delegated this responsibility to the schools. So actually the processes of validation and recognition are done together because the school can do that. But in many countries you have the validation process, which is done by the school, and then afterwards the formal recognition is done by the qualification authorities. I don't know what it's like here in Latvia. Finally, or to finish off, I'd like to point your attention towards some sources of further information and support that you can use in your work to develop ECVET both nationally and also at institution level. First of all, there is the ECVET user group, which actually another word of that would be the ECVET Parliament, because it's representative of national authorities that meet usually once a year to discuss ECVET, sort of like overall general aspects of ECVET and in which direction should we take ECVET, what should be done. That's the ECVET user group. Then you also have the European ECVET Secretariat, which is the one that I am representing here today. And what the ECVET Secretariat does is actually 4 things. First of all, that it organizes specific seminars and forums on ECVET. You have the annual forum, you have the peer learning activities, and you have the thematic seminars on particular aspects of ECVET. There is actually one next week in Brussels about the Memorandum of Understanding and the Learning Agreement. Should the current templates be reviewed, or can we somehow digitalize them so that we have, as is the case in higher education in some cases, a paperless procedure. Then the ECVET Secretariat also issues a magazine, which is available from the website of the European Secretariat on ECVET, what's happening in ECVET. And I've actually been asked, can I write a short text about this event for the ECVET magazine? So, you can see if you recognize yourself in the actual seminar here in that article once it appears. And then also what the ECVET Secretariat does is it has a number of experts. We are about 5, 7, depends a bit, experts at European level who travel around and participate in organizations like this in order to give the overall European perspective on ECVET. But that's the European ECVET Secretariat. Then you also have the national team of ECVET experts. ECVET experts, they are meant to assist in the implementation of ECVET at national level, and also maybe at a more general level to take up problems that is seen as a challenge in a national context. What we do in Denmark is that, first of all, we are available to users, that if they have an institution has some kind of problem with implementing ECVET, they can call on one of the experts who will then look into the case and assist them. And then we also take up some general problems that are perceived by many as a problem and try and do something about that. And right now, I can mention in Denmark what we're doing, because we've seen that very many projects, they have a problem with formulating learning outcomes. So we're making a handbook about how to formulate learning outcomes. How do you do that so that there is a maximum understandability across borders of learning outcomes? And I would also draw your attention to the information material and the examples of good practice that are available on the website called ECVET Toolkit. It's a very simple website. It's called ECVET, www.ecvettoolkit.eu, where you will find a lot of practical examples from all over Europe about implementation of ECVET, including examples of completed memorandum of understanding or learning agreement, including a database of learning outcomes from different projects. So it's actually a goldmine of information, that practical, hands-on information that you can use in your normal everyday work with ECVET. And then finally, you also have the European Centre for the Development of Vocational Training, CEDEFOP, which is following ECVET and which is regularly undertaking studies to illuminate certain aspects of ECVET or take the temperature of ECVET in a general European perspective every 3 years. So they make a European overview of the implementation of ECVET in Europe to see how far it has progressed and what the problems are. So if you're really hardcore ECVET fanatic, then you will also consult these studies, these papers that are issued by CEDEFOP. I can see time is running out, so I would just finally try and do some kind of evaluation of ECVET and say, what has the impact of ECVET been? And I'm doing that, and I have to underline this, I'm doing that as an independent researcher. I'm doing that on the basis of the research that I've done outside of an ECVET context, or the observations that I've made. But one thing, and the most important thing, is actually that you can see that ECVET projects that have used ECVET, that are using ECVET, have experienced some kind of increase in quality, because the understanding between partners has been better. There's especially this focus on learning outcomes. The procedures are in place. So what comes out of the project, the actual outcomes of the project, the learning outcomes, are actually at a higher level than before. So ECVET has definitely had an impact on the quality of projects. In my personal view, this is one of the most important contributions of ECVET. Recognition is also very prominent, but one has to say that ECVET never developed, or hasn't developed as yet, to reach the same status of that of ECTS in higher education as a credit transfer system. And there's a simple explanation. That's the diversity and the big difference between VET systems, VET institutions in Europe. Much, much, much bigger than in higher education. But even so, it has contributed significantly to the fact that more and more stays are now officially recognized. They are no longer seen as some kind of holiday or something that, well, if you go 2 weeks abroad, you have to prolong your study time with 2 weeks. Definitely it has highlighted the recognition, and the procedures and the tools have facilitated this process. And that also leads me on to the third of these things that I'd like to highlight. And this is not sort of like a 360-degree evaluation of ECVET. It's just some points that I think are very interesting to illuminate in here. That is ECVET as a common language, because it's given us some tools, procedures, a common framework of understanding of how we deal with the issues of recognition and quality in VET. So that is and has been a very important contribution of ECVET. And actually, there are discussions. The recommendation of ECVET is from 2009, and usually these recommendations, they don't have a long lifetime. They usually live around 10 years or something like that. So the time is, there is now some considerations. Should we review the recommendations? Should we try and push it a little further? Or what should we do about ECVET? So there is currently this movement or this interest. And I think one of the things that they may put into a new recommendation is that we have a uniform way of how we pronounce ECVET, because it's pronounced very differently from country to country. Some call it ECVET, some call it ECVET, some call it ECVET. So I call it ECVET, but others they call it ECVET, so whatever. So thank you for your attention. I know we have little time, but is there any immediate questions about understanding that you would like to ask? I mean, we don't have the time at this stage to go into big explanation, but if you have any immediate questions, I'm happy to answer them.
One of the most important questions now comes: what you will make as a title for this great article in this magazine? How, let's say, ambitious are Latvians to implement ECVET, like from tomorrow, or something like this?
Well, it all depends on you, doesn't it?
Look at them, they are so ambitious. Okay, labi, jautājumi, questions? Yeah.
Thank you, Søren. Really highly appreciated your presentation and your general insight. So I have a question in respect of Denmark and in respect of implementing ECVET principles or elements in geographical mobilities. Do you know, is your agency saying that it's kind of more or less obligatory, or it's still for the projects they can do as they want? We know that for Erasmus Plus it's not obligatory, at least in this term. I do hope that it's going to be obligatory for next term. I really do hope, because it will improve meaningful mobilities. But how it's in Denmark, or your feeling how it's in Denmark?
That's actually a good question. There are two sides to that. You can't just answer with a plain yes and no, because for one thing, the parliament has decided that ECVET is not going to be obligatory in Denmark. The implementation is not going to be obligatory. And that is because, as I mentioned, that if we implement ECVET sort of to the letter, it means that we have to change our system in a direction that's not considered to be the direction which we want to go. We don't want a credit-based system. We want the system that we have. So therefore, I mean, I don't foresee that it will be made obligatory, sort of like in an overall national educational context. There is another aspect to that, which is sort of when you go down to project level as well, because you could make ECVET, as you also mentioned, you could make the use of ECVET dependent on funding. So if you want to have funding from Erasmus Plus, or in Denmark we have a big national mobility program that functions alongside Erasmus Plus. So if you want to have funding for that, you have to use ECVET. And there the decision is, at least for the time being, it's very sophisticated reasoning, saying that we will not make ECVET obligatory, because if we can't convince people that it's a good idea to use ECVET, then nothing good will come out of making it obligatory. So if people can be brought to see that if they do this, they will have better quality in their mobility, and they will have an easier time organizing and implementing mobility, because things will be more structured. If we can convince people of that, then ECVET will sort of implement itself. We don't need to make it obligatory. So that's the kind of lines along we're thinking in Denmark, at least for the time being. I mean, you never know.